It's my distinct honor and privilege this morning to introduce Colonel Douglas Mastriano, or Dr. Colonel, or Colonel Doctor, however you want to go, who is a professor in the Department of Military Strategy, Planning, and Operations at the U.S. Army War College in Carlisle, Pennsylvania, so close to Philadelphia. He's also originally from the greater Philadelphia area, coming from New Jersey, went to college outside Philadelphia. So I'm sure he's a great fellow, and I met him last night at dinner. Seems like a great guy. He served for 28 years in the U.S. Army. Started off in 2nd Armored Cavalry Regiment down in Bavaria, and then his career has spanned from there. He's a military intelligence officer. Most germane to this conference, he wrote a book on Alvin York, a new biography of the hero of the Argonne. If you look in the bios that you have, there's a URL there from some materials that he's developed on that, and also I'm sure he'd be happy, as my friend Frank Hoffman likes to call it, there's Chatham House rules where comments are off the record, and this is called Random House rules, where we want to promote people's books. He also has a book that will be coming out on the Meuse Argonne. Without further ado, Doug.
Well, it's a pleasure to be here with you. Strap on your seatbelts here. I'm going to run you through some things on American strategy in the First World War. When I was first offered the opportunity to speak on this, I was thinking, what was American strategy? And I came with one word, none. But it's not so simple. I wish it was, because we could have an early lunch and everyone would be happier, and then you wouldn't have to listen to me talk. But I'm going to hopefully be a little provocative here. I'm going to push you guys with history. I'm going to, if I do my job right, make it relevant to you so you can take back these lessons to your classrooms and hopefully develop a new crew of people interested in the past. I'm a big believer in what Dr. John Lennox says. He's a professor of mathematics at Oxford. And he says, new things are old things happening to new people. Isn't that awesome? New things are old things happening to new people. That's Dr. John Lennox, not Mastriano. I wish I was that clever. I'm from Jersey. What can you say about it? I have to borrow from other people's ideas. But history is my laboratory. Well, scientists have their labs. Us historians, we have our labs. It's called the past. And we're going to look to the past to inform our future. So let's go. So 100 years ago this minute, the Germans and French are fighting over the village of Fleury outside of Douaumont. It's a bloody epic. The village is going to change hands about a dozen times. It's key because there's high ground, and this high ground dominates the next to the last hill that overlooks Verdun. And whoever owns that hill will own the region of Verdun, will be able to direct fire and destroy the French army or protect the French army. So this is going on this instant. And meanwhile, in the United States, our commemorations are virtually non-existent. I appreciate the work of the Centennial Commission, but the funding is just not there, relying on donations or what have you. I wish there was more. So we're going to start at the grassroots level. So I thank everyone for being here, because you're part of the solution, not part of the problem. So American strategy. First, let's define strategy. Here's one we use at the War College. This actually defines national security strategy. It's using all elements of national power. I'm not going to bore you with the War College lecture, but maybe it'd be kind of interesting. But it's leveraging your instruments of power, diplomacy, information, military, and economic means to accomplish your national ends. What's your objectives? Of course, your objectives are tied with your interests. I'm going to cover some of that. What were American interests in this whole epic? But really, to deal with American strategy, we have to start with the 1912 contentious election. You see three men on the ticket there, especially contentious Republican convention. Sound a little familiar here, potentially? We had Taft, the sitting president, and Teddy Roosevelt and him used to be friends. In fact, you could almost say Teddy Roosevelt sort of mentored Taft into the position to take over as president after him. And TR was not pleased with the way Taft did things, so he came into the convention, the Republican convention in 1912 with Teddy Roosevelt's own delegates. And Taft and his delegates ticked them off, so TR and his guys marched out, and we have a third party, the Bull Moose. That sounds great, huh? So the Republicans split in half, giving the election, of course, to Woodrow Wilson. So here's a look in the past. New things or old things happening to new people. Maybe we'll see this in 2016. Who knows? And as Woodrow Wilson's getting ready to be sworn into office, he confides to a friend, "It would be the irony of fate if my administration had to deal chiefly with foreign affairs." Ouch. And then, of course, the war breaks out in 1914. The Russians mobilized. Well, let's go back. Archduke Ferdinand is assassinated in 28 June 1914 in Sarajevo with his wife Sophie. And then, of course, that leads to the war between the Austrians and the Serbians. After about a month of dithering on the Austrian side, I had to deal with this problem. The Russians end up mobilizing after the Serbs deal a bloody blow to the Austrian military. And the Germans mobilize, and well, anyway, read the slide. Yeah, I like the part of the Ottoman Empire almost declaring war on itself. And here's another thing of this presentation. I'm going to give you some background and depth so you have context. So I'm going to get to American strategy, but here's the context of American strategy in 1914. So here's the situation that Woodrow Wilson, the United States, is confronted with, a complex web of alliances before and during the war. Now, you notice some of the colors on there that do not really actually match up with reality, such as what happened to Bella Italia, what happened to the Italians. Originally, Mamma Mia, they're on the German side, and then they say maybe that's not such a good idea. Especially because you see that bulge of Austro-Hungarian territory in Tyrol, north of Venezia, north of Venice. They kind of want that land, but if we're on the German side, we can't take that land, but if we're on the French and British side, we can get that. And they still own that chunk of land, by the way. It's fantastic. I love the cartoon there. There's Kaiser Wilhelm, and John Bull is walking away arm in arm with beautiful France. That's exactly what's going on here. So Germany's facing a two-front war because of the threat that Russia and France pose. They have a tight alliance, almost an Article 5 sort of NATO thing, an attack upon one's an attack upon each other. So the Germans are like, well, how do we win on a two-front war? We've never faced this before. Because 1870, when they fought the French, the Franco-Prussian War, the British stayed out, the Russians stayed out. It was fantastic for the Germans. So they came up, of course, in 1904 through 1906, the Schlieffen Plan. The plan is to take the bulk of your army, throw them against the French, win in 46 days, put everybody on trains, and by then the Russian army is slow, lack infrastructure. They'll be just mobilizing, and we can knock the Russian army out in turn. The only problem was that was a great plan for 1906. Do you think the environment stayed the same in the next 8 years? Were the French not cognizant that the Russians needed time? Of course they were. So the French spent millions of francs to build Russian railroads, and so when 1914 came, as the Germans are just entering Belgium, Russian troops are entering East Prussia. The timetable was thrown off. There's no way the Schlieffen Plan could work, and we're going to find ourselves in a 4-year war with trenches and all that other good stuff that everyone remembers about the First World War. From the get-go, even before the British Expeditionary Force enters the fight and fights the Germans in Mons on the 21st of August, 2 days before that, Woodrow Wilson gives the American position on this war. The United States must be neutral in fact as well as in name during these days that try men's souls. We must be impartial in thought as well as in action. Dithering, daydreaming, and speech-making. You'll see a theme here in a second. But what is neutrality? And I say dithering and daydreaming. Were we truly neutral? Mike Nyberg gave a great presentation, and he laid down the facts. Were we truly neutral based off that definition of neutrality? Neutrality is a state of not supporting or helping either side in a conflict. Who benefited from American neutrality with quotation marks? I wonder. We'll wonder no long. Look at this great picture here. It shows Woodrow Wilson on the left and Kaiser Wilhelm, the Prussian king and emperor, on the right. And, of course, Woody Wilson says, in the name of humanity, I want you to stop your submarine warfare. And then the Kaiser answers, in the name of humanity, I want you to stop the sales of ammunition that's going to France and Britain. So were we truly neutral? Thanks to geography, the French and British had a distinct advantage, not to mention, of course, the German naval blockade. The British naval blockade of the German ports. So were we truly neutral? You decide. I think not. Okay, so neutrality in 1914. We roll into 1915. It's going to be a rough year for American strategy and Woodrow Wilson's policy of neutrality. So, of course, we have this stalemate on the Western Front. The Allies in 1915 are desperate to break out, And since we have parity basically on the Western Front, a lot of guys are still dying, just no major campaigns. So one cabinet official in the British, in the London, in the administration, named Churchill, says, I think if we strike the soft underbelly of Europe, the Ottoman Empire, we can knock them out of the war and weaken the Germans. And so, of course, we have the Gallipoli campaign, which accomplishes nothing. And while this is going on, of course, the Germans are feeling the pinch with the naval blockade in the North and Baltic Seas. So the Germans, if you're a German, how do you break this stalemate? How do you get out of this dilemma that you're in? With no breakthroughs on the Western Front, with American supplies pouring into, not just American, Western Hemisphere supplies pouring into the British Isles and to France, what do? Well, you basically have one option. Since your fleet is bottled up, those ships of the line that you had roaming the Pacific and the Atlantic, they were sunk in the Battle of the Falklands and elsewhere in 1914. So that's off the table. Basically, all you have are submarines. So they go forth. And what do? Because the rules guiding naval warfare really don't address submarine warfare. So the Germans, I'm not a defender of the Germans, so don't get me wrong as I lay it out here. In many cases in 1914 and 1915, if a German submarine is going to sink you, first they're going to surface. They might send a group of guys over on a dinghy or a boat to inspect your cargo, and then they'll give you time to get off your ship, and then they'll sink you. This is the German way of trying to abide by the rules of warfare on the open seas. But unfortunately for them, neutral ships start getting guns mounted on the deck. And then, as you see in this postcard here, there's sometimes a merchantman will just try to ram the German submarines before they have an opportunity to give people a chance to abandon ship. So the Kaiser says, forget that. They're going to do this against our guys. We're just going to sink them on sight. And, of course, that causes problems. On the American side, our strategy is neutrality with a reset. We're going to try to negotiate peace with the French, British, and the Germans. Colonel House, he's not really a colonel, Colonel House is sent over to Berlin. Negotiators are working hard in Paris and London. We're going to reset this whole thing. And if people would just take the time to listen to my words and my good speeches, this is Woodrow Wilson, I'll be able to talk them out of warfare. It's fantastic. Dithering, daydreaming, and speech-making. So the Germans are very open. Why would you think that the Germans are so positive about receiving a peace negotiations to end the war peacefully? Well, I'll get to that. And why would you think the United Kingdom and the French would be so reluctant to receive this almost naive view of neutrality and negotiated peace? Well, it's mostly because of the reality of the war. Take a look at that slide. This is what the Germans had occupied and taken from the French with their successful initial attack of the Schlieffen Plan, which was incomplete, clearly. But 6% of the land, okay, that's a problem. But then look at the labor force. But more importantly, look at the loss of raw materials you need to wage war. How does France survive without that? And on top of all that, what about the loss of lives? And in utter frustration, the French ambassador to the United States, Jean-Jules Jausserand, he finally said to the American attempts to try to convince him to negotiate a peace with the Germans, we would accept peace when the Germans give us back the lives of our dead ones. It's not going to happen. And then, of course, as Mike Nyberg rightly said, Lusitania changed everything. This was a direct assault on the American strategy and American approach to the warfare. Was it realistic? Was it viable? Was it sustainable at this point? What are you going to do? If you look, this is 7 May 1915. Now, keep that date in mind, 7 May. So almost 1,200 folks die, but look how many Americans are on the ship. And the American response, Woodrow Wilson took quick action, mobilized the Army, put the Navy out to sea, called up millions of men to... No, he didn't do any of that. He sent 3 stern notes to the Kaiser. Yeah, fantastic. And with a finger and furrowed eyebrows, you really shouldn't do that. And his 3 notes, basically, you see them right there. First letter, diplomatic note, was that affirmed the right of Americans to cross the open seas. Got it. The second one was repudiating the German claim that the British naval blockade of their ports was illegal, based off interpretation of the Paris Agreement from the 1800s. And if you do this again, it'll be considered deliberately unfriendly to the United States. What is that? That is really tough. I would be scared if I was a Kaiser. So upset was the Secretary of State, William Jennings Bryan, over the tone of the second note that he resigned in anger. I can appreciate that. His position, however, was okay, you're upset about the loss of American lives, but what about the loss of German lives due to this naval blockade of Germany? You're not being fair here, Woodrow Wilson, so I quit. Well, I love that picture. So there's Uncle Sam. He kicked open the door to the German Kaiser. You see the door's damaged, and he hands him a note. Don't do that again. And on the wall behind the Kaiser, it's fantastic if it wasn't so sad. On the wall behind the Kaiser, a picture of all the ships where Americans were killed, or American ships that were attacked. That is classic. Okay. So we had a loss of 128 Americans, 1,198 people altogether on the Lusitania. And 3 days later, we get this brilliant speech from Woodrow Wilson on the American policy and how it's going to change due to this German atrocity. He says the example of America must be the example not merely of peace because it will not fight, but of peace because peace is the healing. I can't even read it anymore. It goes on to be called the Too Proud to Fight speech. This is 3 days later. You imagine now that you lost a loved one or know somebody that was lost on this ship, or you're just upset about it because it's atrocious and your president just comes out. We're too proud to fight. Of course, that's a negative view of that, and I'm using it right here. But it's a war of words in the United States. It's fantastic. Some nations tell stories about Woodrow Wilson's typewriter and that things are going bad when his typewriter's busted, and they make fun of him. He's becoming a lampoon joke around the world based off this policy of just giving speeches and sending notes. And the book he's pulling off the shelf in his hand is called The Art of Polite Letter Writing. And here's one of the comments about the life and times of Woodrow Wilson's typewriter during the First World War. And this is from an Australian paper in Brisbane. Germany has given America some more bluff, and war now seems as far off as a typewriter machine can make it, for Woodrow Wilson. So what's American strategy for 1916? 100 years ago, I already identified for you the vicious fighting outside of Verdun. We're going to have the Battle of the Somme begin on 1 July, more horrific fighting on the Western Front. And what's the United States doing? Maintaining a strict neutrality and endeavors to negotiate a peace through talking the belligerent nations out of fighting and killing each other. And of course, as Mike said, it was an election year, and this changed everything for how the war and foreign policy is going to be framed and viewed. I highlighted some of the key bumper stickers there. Peace with honor. He kept us out of the war. And then, of course, as Mike covered, so I'm on the bridge between Mike and Jennifer. You'll see some overlap here, but it's good overlap. It's the closest election until Bush-Gore in 2000. And it's all framed in the context of what America is or isn't doing about this First World War. So American strategy in 1916 is really Woodrow Wilson is starting to see beyond the war. Now, to his credit, he is visionary. He's not very good with dealing with reality and the facts in front of his face, but he's pretty good looking down the road a couple hundred miles. And he sees that coming out of the war with the status quo, with the old powers still doing things as they did in 1914, is not going to happen. Okay, that's a good thing. That's true. That's visionary. So what is he going to do about it? His vision for the post-World War world is an international institution, of course, the League of Nations, to prevent such wars from happening again. And you see his three fundamentals, and these are key. These are going to shape the American strategy during and after the war, and even up till today. Of course, the chief fundamentals of self-determination, and that attacks French and British colonialism. That's a pretty brave position to take, actually, at that time. And then, of course, number two is all nations have the right for sovereignty, and that's influenced by the position of Belgium and Luxembourg. And then, of course, the only way you really get world peace is through democratic institutions. This is not unlike what we've heard during the Clinton and both Bush administrations. Okay, American strategy in 1917, it still is neutrality and peace. And the buzzword, the bumper sticker that Woodrow Wilson gives until he is entered into the war, of course, is peace without victory. What does that look like? Does that look like Iraq today? Syria today? What is peace without victory? How do you win a war without victory? Are we even talking about winning anything? To me, as I'm going through this, I appreciate the introduction and Mike and the nice words about how you got to meet me last night and you like me. But hopefully it's not the case. The more you know Doug Mastriano, the less you like him. Well, in the case of Woodrow Wilson, the more I read about him, the less I like him. Mike, I'm with you on, man. The digger, he's like, man, why couldn't you see this coming? The shadows are on the wall and you're ignoring it. So the strategy in January through March of 1917 America is unchanged. Neutrality, and we're going to do everything we can to negotiate a peaceful settlement of this through speech giving. But I believe, of course, and history shows that Woodrow Wilson was on a collision course with history. I like that depiction of little Teddy Roosevelt in the corner there, the little teddy bear, because he's back there beating the drums on American preparedness. We've done nothing really to prepare. We're going in cold. This is not good. And then finally, the Germans forced Woodrow Wilson to make a decision. And I believe, as you'll read in my article, is against Woodrow Wilson's very will to go to war. He was just forced into this. Germany is in a bad way in 1917. That they have what's called Ersatzbrot. So it's special bread. So there's not a lot of raw materials and agricultural goods because it's going to the army. So to make bread for the population, we're going to throw in some sawdust. That's special bread, Ersatzbrot. The people are starving in Germany. The soldiers are not. The people are. Kaiser Wilhelm realizes this is a problem. And once again, he unleashes his submarine force. He's got about 105 submarines in his fleet at this time, and it's unrestricted warfare. Sink everything that comes. And with an eye on being able to starve or knock the British out of the war. It's hitting the British with an indirect approach from a strategic point of view. Of course, this is viewed as a violation of international law, especially by the United States. And you see the cost. By March 1917, 200 Americans are dead, more are being killed every day. It's about 500,000 tons of ship are lost in the first month of this warfare, and this is something that even Woodrow Wilson himself can't talk himself out of. To make matters worse, as Mike already mentioned, see the Zimmerman telegram. Now, this is fantastic. So British intelligence pulls up an intercept from Berlin to Mexico City. Basically, hey, if you attack the United States, you can have the Southwest, you'll have our full support, Imperial Germany support. And Arthur Zimmerman is asked, okay, that's clearly British propaganda. Arthur Zimmerman is asked, the Foreign Secretary of Germany, did you send that? Because of course I sent that. Wow, such honesty. Clearly, he could have said that without his British propaganda, but it was a straw that broke the camel's back. Something had to be done to stop the Germans. So the United States enters the war war is asked for on 2 April. You see the Congress votes on the 6th. And by the way, if you want these slides so you don't have to take a lot of notes, email me and I'll send them to you, but it'll have to be without so many pictures because it's just too darn big. So unfortunately, I have to delete a lot of the pics out of there. And this is fantastic, to make the world safe for democracy. That's the takeaway from his speech for Doug Mastriano. So there's a long-range vision that the United States will transform the world to look very democratic/Republican style of government, because that's the only way to preserve peace. So the American war strategy, I have it laid out for you there. And in his speech, Woodrow Wilson says it's all-out war. We got to do everything we can to knock the Germans out, to destroy the German Empire. We're at war with that corrupt regime, that bloody regime, not the people. And you see, of course, that's going to take building an army, modernizing your navy, and then, of course, setting conditions for this new world order, which I delineate in the 3 principles below. I already talked those. In January 1918, President Woodrow Wilson elaborates on his strategy. It's part of the 14 points. I've watered it down to these 5 here. I'm going to read them real quick, that are the 5 basic principles of his strategy as a wartime president. Of course, democratic states are essential for stability and peace in the world. If this is still the American view. Free trade is essential. International laws and institutions, United Nations. Collective security, NATO. The United States is chosen to lead this new world order. So his 14 points echo across the generations to us today, 100 years later. Isn't that interesting? So new things are old things happening to new people. We're standing on the shoulders of giants, or maybe in this case of a dwarf, but either way, we're living with a legacy or the indecision of our leaders from the past. Sorry about that. Leaders matter. You know, I love giving my pitch on Sergeant York because we see in personal lives matter. And what your students do with their lives could change the course of history. You know, in the case of Alvin York, I'm going to digress. Alvin York was a drunk womanizer in 1914-15. His life turned around, and he became a guy that changed the course of World War I for the American Army in the Argonne Forest. In the American Civil War, we have Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain. Yeah, he gave a great speech to the mutineers of the 2nd Maine, convinced all 120 of those guys to join the fight. But did you know he had a stuttering problem as a young man? He's a severe introvert, afraid to speak publicly. Life can change the course of history, and it could be somebody unpromising in your classroom. So offer them hope. Okay, back to American strategy. So the mobilization of the U.S. Army. General Pershing is designated as the American commander. He meets with President Wilson once and only once during the war. They're going to meet afterwards during the Versailles Treaty. Of course, there's going to be a giant draft. But really nothing was done to prepare for the nation for war, as Mike mentioned. And in fact, one of the bumper stickers was, why aren't we preparing for war? Teddy Roosevelt and others were appealing to the leaders, do something to get this nation ready for war. And they were rebuffed by Baker, the Secretary of War. To plan for war is to violate the terms of neutrality. Oh my goodness, really? So here's the situation in 1917. The Russians are going to be knocked out of the war to a Bolshevik revolution. That's not good. That's going to free up 1 million Germans on the Eastern Front. And are they just going to sit around and enjoy the vodka in Ukraine? No, of course not. But at the same time, the French army, a portion of them had mutinied due to a failed offensive. So the French are down, the Russians are out, and the America, that we need a year or two to get there. There's my great-grandpa chasing Pancho Villa in 1916 there in Mexico. But the U.S. Army at this point, when we entered the war, is about 220,000 soldiers. The core of our force really are the National Guard divisions. No American planes will fly in combat in World War I. No American tanks will fight on the Western Front. You've got to be kidding me. This modern progressive nation, cold start. To give you a view, here's a view of the European armies in 1914. Where would the United States fall? You see that midget on the right? There he is again. That's Belgium. We'd be right behind Belgium, not even on the screen. We'd be behind Belgium and just ahead of Montenegro. What? In size of U.S. Army, in size of military ground force. That's how we're going to enter this world war. To make matters worse, our equipment isn't up to date. We have our guys in those cool Montana campaign hats. I'd like those. That's outstanding. It's not going to do you much on the Western Front. What kind of helmet are you going to use? We're going to use British helmets. Fantastic. We're going to use a mix of American and British weapons. Outstanding. Of course, we'll have some manufactured here because the manufacturers had been producing them to support the war effort. So a lot of people watch the Sergeant York movie, and he's running down with a Springfield rifle in that movie. Well, that's what they had on set. Actually, in real life, he had an M1917 Eddystone Enfield, which is a retooled rifle we were selling to the British, a 3-03. So we're retooling weapons for American rounds. We're using French machine guns, French artillery, aircraft tanks. That is great. So it's going to be impressive to build a force of about 4 million soldiers. 2 million will make it to France. But what's the quality of these troops? Here's what Lieutenant Jones of the 82nd Division said. Foreign instructors arrived to show us the only way to win the war. The French swore by the hand grenade and the shosha, light machine gun. The British swore by the bayonet, and we swore by, we swore and worked a little harder. We didn't know what we were doing. To compound matters, as Mike said, you have all these foreigners in the ranks, and here's what Colonel Buxton said, also the 82nd Division. Approximately 20% of the men were of foreign birth, and several hundred were not citizens of the United States. Training was seriously handicapped by a substantial percentage of men who were unable to read, write, and in some cases even speak English. Those are some of my distant relatives from Italia, and Russian Jews, and Greeks, and people from other parts of Eastern Europe, and they're all thrown together to serve in these all-American division. What's the problem if you have a bunch of soldiers working for you, you can't understand your orders? That's a slight problem, maybe. It's going to show up when this unit enters the line, in August 1918, and there's a Greek platoon out on patrol. The Italians are defending the trenches, and the Italians yell something that the Greeks can't understand. It's a call sign, the password, and the Greeks say something the Italians can understand, and they start shooting at each other. This is fantastic. So at nighttime, the officers, who are up at 5 o'clock in the morning, training their soldiers until 1900, that's 7 p.m. Air Force time. Then they're spending the next 2-3 hours every night teaching basic English to the Italians, the Greeks, and the Poles, and what have you. And then, to make matters worse, General Pershing rejects the advice from the British and French on how to fight the war. Basically, it's an arrogant approach. We're Americans. We're natural fighters. We've proven it on the frontier. And we get there. You guys got in trenches because you don't know how to fight. We're natural fighters. We're going to get there with the bayonet and the rifle, and we're going to win this. Outstanding. Except the French tried that in 1914, and George Clemenceau, the French premier, says, if the Americans do not permit the French to teach them, then the Germans will do so. So who pays the price for the lack of preparedness? Now, this all is tied in with a strategy. We have an American strategy of dithering, daydreaming, and speech-making, and who has to pay the price for that? Did Woodrow Wilson pay the price for that? Of course not. It will be the guys and gals in your classroom if we fail them again like this. That's why this history matters. Let's not repeat that. I prefer looking to the past and learning from other people's mistakes and repeating them to myself in my own generation, because my son might have to pay the price, horrific price. Here's what Captain Day said of the excellent training they got before and after the war. In reality, we got some excellent training. It is, however, a matter of grave discussion why, when at Camp Gordon, we were taught to sing, while after the armistice, we were taught to fight. That is what happens when you have an army going from 0 to 60 with no gasoline in it. Really, these guys, they were called a singing division. They were given a book with Christian hymns and patriotic songs, and they sung all day long. And they weren't certified as a combat division until December 1918, a month after the war ended. That's after, by the way, they've spent 2 months fighting in the line, the Germans. Isn't that fantastic? Not really. So the situation, November 1917, we've been at war since April. The United States sends 100,000 troops, basically all we got, because the other Joes have to help train. So it's symbolic. They march to France. It's fantastic. They march across portions of England. It's great, and really nothing happens for a while. Meanwhile, the Germans have a cunning plan to knock the French and British out of the war before enough Americans can show up to make a difference. Thus is the lack of preparedness. 1 million Germans are transported from Russia during the winter of 17-18, show up on the Western Front, retrained, refitted, re-equipped, trained to be tough fighters, stormtroopers. They launch 5 major attacks on the Western Front, destroy a British army. I mean, it's a mess. Paris is evacuated. There's panic, and it looks like we're going to lose. But the Allies hang on with American support. We're finally there. Of course, during all this, one of the key components of the American strategy is having an independent U.S. Army. And this is the whole issue I have on the screen here. To amalgamate or not to amalgamate, that is the question. Woodrow Wilson's clearest guidance and best guidance he gave the Pershing is, I want an independent United States Army. Why would he want that? When you can get your troops into the fight faster if they work for British units, if they serve as fodder for the French units, they'd be serving underneath experienced leaders with experienced soldiers. Well, of course, I think he's looking after the war. If I have an independent army, I'll have a key seat at the Versailles Treaty. Of course, we didn't know it was going to be called a Versailles, but the negotiations at the end of the war and help shape the new world. Well, it's going to pay off. But the price of not amalgamating, of course, is going to take more time for the Americans to show up to make a difference on the Western Front. The Germans culminate in July of 1918. That means their attacks have expended their ability to continue the attack. They're basically on the defensive now, the Germans being they. General Foch, the first Supreme Allied commander in Europe, it's not Eisenhower, General Foch, first Supreme Allied commander, he received these powers in April of 1918 during the crisis. He calls Pershing into his office with Pétain, the French commander, with Hagee, the British commander. Why the King of the Belgians isn't there, I don't know. And he says, I think the Germans are done. We need to go over on the offensive. And Pershing, Hagee, and Pétain are like, no way, we're not ready for that. Foch prevails, and the next day they all agree it's time to end the war, maybe in 1918. He's going to launch, Foch is going to direct a broad front attack beginning in September 1918, broad front attack. Does it sound like 1944 to you? Did Eisenhower borrow this? I think he may have. Foch was very concerned about the alliance. Now, look, the United States does not trust the British and French and their motives, so we're an associated power. We're not an allied. We're an associated power, just to confuse things up. But Foch, although he received a lot of pressure from Clemenceau, his boss, his political boss, and others, to amalgamate the Americans, and he pushed Pershing hard. Pershing won in the end. He was very careful not to offend any of the Allied commanders. Eisenhower's leadership style was that way as well. I believe a lot Eisenhower did not make it to the war, to World War I, but I think he learned something from Foch and how to lead an alliance. Okay, I'm going to wrap up this discussion here and I think get into questions here. So what is the last 47 of the days of the war? The Americans will kick off that offensive. It's called the Meuse Offensive, and then followed by a British, French, and Belgian attack on the entire Western Front with all those arrows I just showed you. You see the so what? In the end, by 1 November, the Americans had broken the line. Now, look, the British had achieved success further in the north, but you should note something there. If you look in the arrow in the lower right-hand corner, that's the American sector. That's the Meuse right there. But more importantly, you see this rail network? It goes to the French town of Sedan there. This rail network is part of only 3 that supports the German army in the Western Front. If the Americans or the French, if anyone can sever or threaten that rail network there, you'll compromise the German position on the Western Front. Therefore, this was the most dangerous opposition the Germans faced. They could give up time and space. They can give up geography in the north, which they did. And the Canadians will achieve, leading the British Expeditionary Force, will achieve that breakthrough and drive this way towards Mons. So basically you have 2 German armies. You have the frontline German army in August, September 1918. They're to hold the front line. And then the second German army is 24 reserve divisions who get on trains anywhere in the Western Front and can be in a sector within 24 to 48 hours. General Foch needs that reserve army tied up, and it works. The Americans attack in the Meuse Argonne, and almost all those divisions show up in the American sector, which opens a way for victory in the north. So no one nation or no one army won the war. You'll see a lot of that in some American books. Be careful about that. It was clearly an Allied effort. That's the so what. Just look at the bottom few bullets, though. When the war ended, the Americans had 2 million soldiers in the line, holding more of the line than any other army except the French. So that gives you a good, prominent position in the negotiations after the war. And then, of course, the post-American war strategy was to create a new world order. And Wilson and his vice president were giving excellent speeches out there, and he wooed and convinced many of the European leaders that there needed to be a League of Nations with some teeth behind it to prevent this sort of outcome again. However, there were problems. As you can imagine, the Allies, the French, British, the Belgians wanted a piece of the pie. They wanted reparations. They wanted to punish Germany. That's just part of the reason setting conditions for the next and bloodier world war. To make matters worse, Wilson spent a lot of his time demonizing his Republican rivals and the Republican Senate. So when he came to them to ratify this League of Nations, of course, the Republicans, there's no way in heck they were going to approve that. So he won over the Europeans and failed to win over the American people. So America will send 4 divisions into German Rhineland with the British and French, occupy that land for about a year, and then after that we'll withdraw, and there'll be no teeth behind the League of Nations. And we'll see that culminate in the 30s when the Italians are attacking Abyssinia, Ethiopia, and King Selassie is crying before them, and the League of Nations is powerless to stop the Italian expansion. Keep in the context of the time as well, at the peace treaties in Paris is Ho Chi Minh of Vietnam fame, and others looking for Wilson to live up to the 14 points. We've heard self-determination. We want that. Does it happen? No. Colonialism expands after World War I. The French and British carve up, based off the 1916 Sykes-Picot Agreement, carve up the Middle East, carve up the Ottoman Empire, carve up Eastern Europe. Nations that hadn't existed for a long time are reborn. Ukraine's borders are reborn. The borders of the Baltic states are created. It's fantastic. So we're living with a lot of the legacy that came out of the First World War and what we did and did wrong. So with that, over to you for your questions. Bring it on.
Just turn your pen side to a
Fire away.
Aaron Gullius, Mott Community College. With regard to Wilson's post-war strategy and the self-determination and its potential impact on colonialism, did he have any sort of specific thoughts about what that would mean for America's colonial holdings in the Philippines and so forth?
It is ironic because we did have colonial holdings. And this idea that America was an isolationist nation in 1914 is fallacious, since we had a string of well, not just colonies, but pieces of territory stretching across the Pacific Ocean and the Caribbean. No. There was talk with the president, with Aquino and others in the Philippines of potential, but we're in the middle of fighting them as well, especially in the Moros area. So it is ironic it wasn't consistently applied. Over here, I see there's a string of questions. Yes? No?
Marciano A. Womogo High School, Litchfield, Connecticut. So Wilson says he wants to make the world safe for democracy, and the New York Times recently published a map that showed how each nation in the world thought, what each nation in the world thought was the nation that was the greatest threat to world peace. And if you looked at the map, it's overwhelmingly the United States. So if we look at that and we say that maybe the rest of the world perceives that making the world safe for democracy is not a great idea, how does that lesson translate to our students today?
Thank you for that question. And that's a tough question. I think we need to get it out of our heads that Jeffersonian-like democracy works in all nations and all cultures and all civilizations and societies. The idea that we could impose on Baghdad our style of government overnight, speaking hyperbolically, of course, our type of democratic structures that will bring the Kurds, Shiites, Sunnis, and Turkmen and others together, is fallacious, because that wasn't even true in our own experience. Why did we fight the American Civil War? Was the democracy ironed out during the revolution? Of course not. There were issues outstanding. As far as an interventionist nation, now, we're obviously less so these recent years. Clearly, many of you realize the impact, and all of us lived through the effect of 9/11. So that changed something in the American psyche. And it seemed like we're clinging to the idea is that if only these other nations were democratic, that would avert this sort of tragedy, this sort of hostility. But I think that's a bit naive in its view. Because clearly, what happens when you have open and fair elections in Egypt or Algeria that brings in a radical party? In Germany, Hitler's party was elected to power by 40-some% of the popular vote in Germany. I mean, what kind of outcome do you want? And are you going to be able to live with the outcome, even though it might not be the sort of government you want? That's a tough issue. It's an unresolved. The issue you bring up is unresolved, and the lesson is be careful. Try not to view other nations through your rose-colored glasses. Our type of government works well for us and people with our history and experience, and religion and cultural background, and it might not work elsewhere, as we've seen. Other question over here?
Richard Vandenbosch, Modesto Junior College, Modesto, California. My question is this. Looking at Wilson's strategy post-Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, how would you see that as changing? How did he react to that particular treaty, and how would you see his strategy changing as a result of that?
So you want me to address how the United States responded after the Germans came up with a negotiated peace with the Russians and dividing up almost all Eastern Europe. It was viewed as illegitimate and unacceptable. And the American position, you'll see it coming out of Versailles, are going to give those territories to Poland, to Ukraine, to Latvia, Estonia, Lithuania, and what have you. So it's illegitimate, and it was negotiated what was viewed, by the way, with an illegitimate government in Russia as well. But it did set the conditions for the modern borders of Eastern Europe we're looking at today. So when we're sitting and a decision was just made by the United States to begin permanent rotations of a brigade through the Baltic states. So right now, rotating through about 600 soldiers on any rotation in perpetuity. Now it's going to be 4,600 soldiers, and that goes directly back to 1919 and loosely back to 1917, Brest-Litovsk. Other questions here? Yes, over here, sir.
Tom Daniel, W.P. Davidson High School, Mobile, Alabama. You mentioned Sergeant Alvin York. Could you elaborate and say a few, give us a little bit more information about his contributions, particularly based on your recent research in your book?
I'll pay you $20 later on. That's outstanding. Any opportunity to talk about York? Wow. The York story is fascinating to me because it just shows you how a life can change the course of history, and I did allude to that in my remarks. So we have a guy growing up in anyone from Tennessee in here? So do you know where Pall Mall, Tennessee is? Oh, outstanding. So I won't say it's nowhere, Tennessee, but it's out in the sticks, Tennessee, even today. It is on the Kentucky border. And in 1911, York grew up in a typical large family. And in 1911, his dad is kicked by a mule because his dad was shoeing the mule to try to raise extra money and is going to die. York is the oldest of the boys left at home, so he's in charge of mom, this farm, all the responsibility, and he can't handle it. So to blow off steam, he goes to the Kentucky border, which is just 5 miles up the road, and he goes to these places called blind tigers. And in these blind tigers are shacks built on the Kentucky-Tennessee border, and just like in a 1941 movie with Gary Cooper, down the middle of the shacks is painted the border, Tennessee, Kentucky. So when the police show up from one state, you grab your booze, which is illegal, and stagger to the other side. And when they leave, you go, anyway. It's interesting there's no joint raids on these drinking establishments. Now, this is not the sort of place you're going to go to watch a soccer game on a giant plasma TV. It's not like that. You're there to get drunk, to chase girls. But while you're doing that, of course, you're going to get in knife fights and gun fights, and some people die in these drinking establishments. So York's mom, of course, she's worried about Alvin. She sends a pastor to talk to him, but he wants nothing to do with her. And then finally, a neighbor girl catches his eye, Gracie Williams. I'm going to go fast through this here because it's not a York lecture. But the only way he can see Gracie Williams is to go to church because her dad's one of the elders in the church. So he goes to church. They have a revival meeting on 1 July 1915, and he becomes a Christian, and his life changes. And he becomes a respectable man in his community. And then he's drafted to go to war. And when he's reading the Ten Commandments, thou shalt not kill, it's like, I can't go to war. He's got a third-grade education. He doesn't go to the original Hebrew, thou shalt not murder. That's different than kill. He just sees it, you will not kill, I can't be in the army. He applies for exemption 3 times, it's rejected. He goes to the army, he shows up, and he says, I'm going to be quiet about my pacifism here and just try to be a good soldier. And he stands out because he does everything he's told and he does it well. And they want to promote him to corporal. And then when he's summoned to his company and battalion commander's office, he's like, I can't be corporal. I don't even want to fight. It's against my religion. They're like, what? What's wrong with you? You're such a good soldier. We want to keep you. And you're such a great shot, by the way. He's the best shot in the division. So they do something that I'm afraid that I wouldn't do if I was so busy. Captain Danforth and Major Buxton, his commanders, are building a new force. They're new to the Army, and they have all these foreigners. They have Italians, Greeks, Irish. They have all these guys who've never been soldiers. They don't know what they don't know. And then they have to spend hours at night talking to this conscientious objector. Thank God they took the time, because without Danforth or Buxton, York wouldn't have stayed in. They're going over scriptures and having a discussion, York says. It's not a yelling match. And Danforth finally reads from Ezekiel 33, and he was like, okay, it's the watchman on the wall, Ezekiel 33. I can serve in the army, but I can't kill for my country. And they're like, what do you do with this guy? Okay, you're Corporal York, you're staying in the army, and we're going to trust you to figure it out. So 8 October 1918, things are looking bad. Now, the reason why the 82nd Division, his division, is attacking the Argonne is try to save the Lost Battalion. Lost Battalion has been under siege for 5 days. It's not looking good. So bad that American artillery had been falling on top of the Lost Battalion, killing or wounding 89 of the 590 soldiers trapped there. And it was a bad situation for their commander, Charles Whittlesey, Major Charles Whittlesey from 77th Liberty Division out of New York. And it was such a bad situation that the only way they could get back to communicate with headquarters, the Germans had cut the telephone wire, was their last bird, cher ami. And Major Whittlesey writes a message on the leg, stop the artillery, you're killing us for God's sake. They put the message on the bird's leg, and cher ami is flying in the middle of a barrage. He's terrified. And he stops and he lands on a nearby tree. Major Whittlesey says, get that bird out of here. And there's a private throwing rocks and sticks, and cher ami's not leaving. And finally, the private climbs up the tree, scares the bird away, and the bird goes to the next tree. And he has to do that once again. Finally, he takes off. Germans are watching for courier pigeons. Whether he's shot by a German or hurt by a fragment from floating artillery, I have no idea. But cher ami is a U.S. Army bird. Oh, he's going to get back. But he gets back missing an eye, missing a leg, has a hole in his breast. Thank God his leg with the message on it is still attached. And he hobbles to HQ and falls over, and they stop the barrage, and he saves the day. Now, cher ami, he lives another year. He receives a citation, and a small pension to live on. Some people said it was bird feed, but it was enough for him to get by on. And you can see him on display in the Smithsonian today. But York is part of that story. And so York goes into this fight on 8 October 1918, not willing to kill any Germans, but his units being destroyed. 17 Americans, including York, break through, get behind German lines, capture a German headquarters, have 70 Germans behind German lines. What do we do with them? York's not in charge yet. They're trying to squish these Germans together. The Germans are dragging their feet on purpose because there's a machine gun on the hill above. And sure enough, the machine gunner's on the hill underneath the command of Lieutenant Paul Lipp, a tailor from Stuttgart, Germany, waves at the Germans, runter, get down. The Germans hit the deck. The Americans, whoa, what's going on? Machine gun kills 6 of the Americans, wounds 3. Only 8 Americans are left. Laying on top of 70 German prisoners. York's now in charge. Why does he change his mind on fighting? He looks over to his only friend in the army. Look, he's a constant objector. How many friends did he have in the army? Plus, he's not Italian, he's not Greek, he's not Russian, so he doesn't fit in. He's an oddball. He's not drinking wine and chasing the girls. His best friend was just killed by the German machine gun. He says, and it's not enraged. I got to stop this. He charges up the hill, outflanks the German machine guns. I found the position. I have the artifacts where he picked off, I have all 46 rounds. And he's shooting the Germans, machine gunners, and a rifleman. And in between shooting them, he's yelling them to surrender. Stop shooting. Just surrender to me. And they won't listen to him. So he kills 19 Germans, runs down the hill. Another German group sees him, does a bayonet attack on him, and he picks them off, shooting them from back to front like hunting turkeys. Because if you shoot the lead bird, the other birds scatter. And he's like, I can't do that because they'll kill me. So he starts shooting the Germans from back to front. The last to fall is a German Lieutenant Fritz Endres. He was shot in his abs by a Colt 45 pistol. So his abs are blown out, and he's on the ground screaming in pain. Endres's best friend in the army was a battalion commander captured, laying on the ground with the mass of Germans. So the German battalion commander hears his best friend dying. They've been together in the army for 10 years. So he gets up and walks over to York. This guy's name is Paul Fomer. He worked in Chicago before the war, so he speaks great English. And he says to York, English? York's like, what? English. And York says, no, I'm American. And Fomer's like, good Lord, if you stop shooting, we'll surrender to you. And York says, do it. And that leads to the surrender of all 132 Germans in that valley. And it's basically York's action. The Americans get out. He receives a Medal of Honor. And we built a trail in France. So if you ever get money to take your school kids out there, we have 9 markers in French, German, and English. You could do your own tour without Mastriano leading you through the Argonne. But it's these people who rise to the occasion that save the U.S. Army in its hour of need. Because we're attacking. Pershing's goal is we'll attack and just go to the German rear. And it doesn't happen. The Germans stop us dead, and we're stuck in trench fighting. It's awful. But we have Pershing, we have the Lost Battalion, we have others such as Sam Woodfill, just a few miles away from New York action, just individuals rising to the occasion. But that's a heck of a way to get there. I'd rather that we have people trained to be able to operate that way. But going from a cold start, as Woodrow Wilson would have it, there's going to be very few. Thanks for that freebie. Sorry for going on. I love the Sergeant York story because it's relevant for us today. One more question I think we have time for. More? Okay, Ms. Warner.
Kathy Hagee from Rolling Hills Prep in Southern California. In your handout, you on page 5, you had the third paragraph. You talk briefly about what the Army looked like as it entered the war, and you argue that they're not ready to fight a modern war. There's 220,000 men, smaller than the pre-1914 Belgium Army. And then you go on and then build a case for moving into, on page 6, where you say, by the end, the Americans are pouring more than 1.2 million men into the fight and holding more of the front than any nation except France. What do you attribute this massive growth in such short time to?
Okay, so we have the crisis of 1918, and the Americans and people are believing the war is going to end in 1919. Even warplanes 1919 is being developed. It looks like a World War II battle. Thousands of tanks, thousands of aircraft, the strategic bombing of cities. I mean, it's looking like World War II. But the crisis of 1918, when the Germans launched their 5 attacks, forced the British and the French to approach the American leadership and say, we're going to give you every ship we have to get every soldier, fighting man over here as quickly as possible. So that's why we see this rapid, accelerated buildup of infantrymen, artillerymen, cavalrymen, fighters, and then we'll bring the other stuff, the engineers and other stuff behind them. So that's why the rapid growth is thanks to Allied shipping.
So we're seeing mostly boots on the ground in regards to soldiers, but we're not necessarily seeing the infrastructure of the U.S. Army or the U.S. military really being as strong at that point. It almost looks better and bigger than we really are.
Okay. So it was a rough go for the U.S. Army in 1917. Of course, I'm including the Division of Marines as well. 17 and 18. But by the end of 18, the industrial base is catching up to us, and actually there's an infrastructure in place. It takes about 2 years to get that going, and that's going to be a lesson learned for FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, in 1940. It was funny. It was during one of my research trips, I was talking to a German gentleman on the Strassenbahn in Stuttgart, and he's like, "What do you do for a living?" I'm like, "I'm a historian." He's like, "Ha! What a waste! Ha! You can't do nothing with history." And I said, "I sure am glad that some of our people, leaders in 1945, remembered the lessons of 1918 and prepared for war. We had a Selective Service Act invoked by FDR before the United States was in the war. Europeans are fighting, so we have an army being built, we have the industry being tooled, ships being commissioned, aircraft being designed, so it's not a complete cold start for us in 1941. So the lesson is there was an Army infrastructure in 1918, 1919. We had a real force to negotiate with there, and that's why I put that piece in the articles. Yes, we paid a high price for a lack of preparedness. We got there the hard way. The American soldiers and the units, they had French liaison officers working with them, and the French would cooperate and help the Americans learn on the fly. Let me give you an example. General Douglas MacArthur. Does that ring a bell to some of you guys here? Doug MacArthur? So he's by the Argonne fight, he's commanding the 42nd Rainbow Division, and my wife's grandfather was serving that division. And they're fighting for their lives, the 42nd Division, to seize from the Germans Côte de Châtillon, which is not too far from the Meuse Argonne American Cemetery. It's a key hill on the German Siegfried Line, so their final belt. If you get Côte de Châtillon, you break the German line in the center and you can break through. First attack goes in, and the brigade is butchered. He sends another brigade in, they're butchered. And finally, his corps commander comes down and says, "Doug, if you don't take it this third time, you're fired." Imagine how history would have been changed. The relief of Doug I wish I was general. Doug MacArthur, Doug Mastriano, commander, 42nd Division. Yeah. I have a rich fantasy life, clearly. Bear with me. Sorry, man. Corps commander says, "If you don't take that hill tonight, you're done." Doug MacArthur, where would the hero of the Philippines be, and of Incheon and all that, the commander, really the governor of Japan after the war, after World War II? History would have changed. But he gets the brigade together and says, "Guys, we're going to attack one more time." It's a one-brigade attack in a three-brigade division. And the battalion commanders all ask him, "Well, how are you going to do it, boss?" "Well, we're going to do the same way we tried it the last two times." And finally, but some of the junior leaders are like, "Oh, stop. Could you give us 10 minutes? Come back and we'll have a plan." And so it's soldiers coming up with ideas of our faulty approach. So much for this frontal attack against machine guns. I have eyewitness accounts from German machine gunners from 125th Landwehr-Württemberg Regiment. Just in amazement, why are the Americans attacking 1914 style against our 1918 machine guns? They're feeling bad for us. So these battalion commanders tell Doug MacArthur to come back in and say, "Boss, we got the plan. One battalion will hit frontally, like we've done the last two times. The Germans are expecting that. The other two battalions will swing around the German flank and get them from behind." Wow, really? That's tactics 101. We do it. It works. Doug MacArthur goes on to infamy in history, and it's based off of some innovation from junior leaders in his unit that saved his career. Wow. The Meuse Argonne, and you're going to hear more from Jennifer on this, is a fascinating fight because there's one point in the battle where you're going to have Captain Harry S. Truman commanding a battery of guns in the 35th Division. Nearby will be Lieutenant Colonel George S. Patton with a handful of French Renault tanks. It's absolutely superb. Doug MacArthur's around the corner. I mean, it's wow. So a whole generation is shaped by this war. And our history today, Matt, is shaped by it. And we're living in the shadows of that. Sir in the corner?
Dave King from Tunstall High School, Dry Fork, Virginia. Two-part question. One is, I had an uncle who enlisted at 15, lied about his age, 37th Division. Arrives in France a year later, had a year of training. And yet that division was not prepared, I guess, to fight with the war the way it was. So I wonder what they were doing or how they were training. The second part is, where did Pershing come up with those tactics of just going ahead and leaving your flanks open?
Okay, so I had slides on this, actually. I took them out because I was trying to cover a lot of ground. What was Pershing's experience? 1898, 1899 Spanish-American War, frontal attack, San Juan Hill, with Teddy Roosevelt's guys next to him, leading Buffalo soldiers. On the frontier, some with Indians, chasing Pancho Villa around in New Mexico and Texas and what have you, into northern Mexico. And the idea that we could translate, and he saw them work successfully in his career, and the idea that he could take those frontier colonial-style tactics and apply them in a 1918 problem baffles my mind. I used to admire Pershing a lot, but just in the case of Wilson, the more I find out, the less I like him. I know my vision is colored by being a colonel in the Army, understanding strategy and operational art, which really didn't exist in the Army back then. But at the same time, it's painfully obvious, if you have a war going on, a major war, why aren't people over there studying that and sending back lessons learned? And this is how, because I violently disagree with the idea that the commanders in the Western Front, generally speaking, what's the saying go? Lions led by donkeys. I don't buy that. Yes, there were problems, especially in some of the French and British commands, got it. But generally, these are great minds like yours trying to figure out how to get out of a wicked problem. And in the end, the French will be the first to innovate with small unit tactics to try to get Douaumont back, that key fort in Verdun. The Germans will see small unit tactics and perfect that with stormtrooper tactics. And how we fight today goes back to 1916 France, 1918 Germany. But the French did innovate first. But it's all these. It's at the individual level. Follow-up question, because I'm missing something here.
Well, I just asked, what were we doing for a year? I mean, we had units that trained for a year, but they got there and they weren't ready.
Yeah, so 35th is going to be part of the initial attack in the Meuse-Argonne campaign, and they're going to take the town of Vauquois. Now, if you go to the Meuse-Argonne, of course, go to the cemetery. It's the biggest American cemetery in Europe. It's a lot bigger than Normandy, where everyone goes to. It's 14,246 of our heroes at Meuse-Argonne. And there's so much to see there beyond the Sergeant York Historic Trail. Of course, you have the Lost Battalion. But maybe even more interesting is Vauquois, which the 35th is going to liberate. This Vauquois, it's the French and Germans are fighting over hills, because if you own the hills, you can command the battlefield with a king of battle, artillery. And indeed, Vauquois was one of those giant hills in the middle of the Meuse Valley. And so the French and Germans couldn't break through, so they started tunneling. There's 17 kilometers of tunnels today that you can go through with a guide. It's a long tour. It's interesting, 90 minutes if you don't mind it underground. Blowing each other up from underneath the ground, 504 craters. The hill split in two. 35th is going to attack in that sector, and they're going to actually liberate that. They're going to trap the 2nd Imperial Guards Foot Regiment in Vauquois. Now, on the German side, I admire their history. Their last message before they were wiped out was, we're trapped in Vauquois, we're surrounded on all sides by the enemy, by the Americans, long live the Emperor. That was the last message before they were all killed. It's like, wow. They're not dying for their country, not unlike what our guys do and what we celebrate. But 35th, after they get to beyond Vauquois, their leaders are leading from the front. And most of the leaders are killed or wounded. And by the end of the first day of fighting in Meuse-Argonne, the 35th Division is combat ineffective. And had the Germans launched a counterattack against them, they would have rolled them up. The only unit that was combat effective was the Engineer Battalion. And they went forward to hold the line in the same spot where General Patton was shot in his buttocks. Yeah, Patton's story is interesting as an aside. So Patton's leading his tanks forward. The 35th Division is already breaking down, and he's trying to encourage them to come forward. He crawls out of his Renault French tank. He's leading the guys, and he receives a wound to his left butt cheek. Now, what's interesting, he's wounded. He's out of the war now. He likes showing off his war wound, especially when he's at the beach at Coney Island in New York. So he cuts a hole in his bathing suit, and of course, he's arrested for indecent exposure by the police. George S. Patton. Gotta love him. Well, okay, so what were we doing? They were learning how to sing. They were learning how to shoot. Marksmanship was a key for General Pershing's approach to war. Now, look, he's the Expeditionary Force commander, so he's sending messages back on how he'd like the Army train, but he can only influence it so much. But he wants them to be able to maneuver, which they're not doing very well, to shoot well, and they're learning how to sing well, because it builds morale. What's interesting to me is the British had a colonial army after the Boer War. The Boer War was early 1900s. And they had the same kind of army the Americans were going to have in 1917 and 1918. But why was the British Expeditionary Force so awesome in 1914? They had something called the Haldane Reforms around 1904. And Lord Haldane said, he's looking at the trends in Europe and says, our army can just chase Bushmen, can chase Dutch farmers across South Africa, can chase Zulu warriors and Indians in the mountains near Nepal, but we can't fight on the continent. So they spend a lot of money and time to build a small but very professional force. So that force shows up in Mons, Belgium on 21st August 1914, and the Germans are receiving so much fire from these riflemen from the British Expeditionary Force that they believe that the BEF is armed mostly with machine guns, and it's just their riflemen just bang, 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 and are killing things. They're wiping the Germans out. And you could almost credit the British Expeditionary Force with completely throwing off the timetable of the Schlieffen Plan and making it impossible for the Germans to achieve their goal of knocking the French out in 47 days, then putting everyone on a train to Russia. There's a lot more to it than that, but that was one key factor why the German plan failed. Sir?
Your argument about the unpreparedness of the U.S. Army is overwhelming, but the same must not have been true about the United States Navy. Surely the Naval War College must have had serious, detailed contingency plans about what they would do if the United States were forced to go into the war. That's question one. Question two is, when and on what basis did the Wilson administration make the decision that, in fact, they had to send a large expeditionary force over to the Western Front, rather than just fight a naval war, defending Great Britain?
So the first thing is on the U.S. Navy, third largest Navy in the world, and pretty darn good, by the way. The only challenge is the German surface fleet is either bottled up in Bremerhaven in Hamburg or has been sunk. So we're facing submarines. So the United States Navy is going to be integrated into how the French and British Navy is dealing with that approach with convoys. And much of what you see in 1942 and 43, the Battle of Atlantic, was already exercised in 1917 and 1918, which is brilliant. And just as another aside, the Battle of Britain in 1940, guess what? The Germans had been bombing London in 1915 with Zeppelins, and 16, and then 17 with bombers, Gotha bombers. So you see the movie The Battle of Britain. Why do they have all these observation points that are duplicate the radar? It's because that's a lesson from World War I. So anyway, that's that. Woodrow Wilson initially called for 500,000 soldiers in his declaration of war speech on 2 April 1917. Early on, the discussion between him, Baker, and Pershing, what the focus was going to be on the Western Front. Baker and Pershing were violently opposed to diverting any troops to Russia, which we did do, and even to Italy. And finally, Pershing only conceded because of the desperate situation at Caporetto when the Italian army collapsed, and we sent over a few token regiments. But generally, the focus was the decision point in Pershing's mind, rightly so, was the Western Front. And I would say that decision was clear by May, June of 1917, early on. So although I was critical of Pershing, he did have a clear vision where the fight needed to be won. And he's like, let's not divert our soldiers off to any other front except the Western Front to win this war, because that was the key point on the battlefield. Sir, I think we had one more, and then I'll wrap.
I just wanted to know how much the strategic leaders knew about the dangers of the flu epidemic and how much it influenced their strategy.
Okay, the so-called Spanish flu.
Correct.
Which is going to kill between 20 to 100 million people. We don't even know how many people died from this. And the fact it's so bad on the Western Front, you could thank in large measure due to the effects of gas it had on people's respiratory systems, that an entire German division is going to be caught unawares on 8 August 1918, which is called the Black Day of the German Army by General Marshal Ludendorff. The strategic leaders had no idea that they're going to be plagued by such a disease. I use the word plague deliberately. That's going to debilitate the entire nations and armies across the front in 1918, 19, and even beyond. And then those soldiers are going to take the disease home with them. So there was no idea. It overwhelmed the nations. Sir? Over to you.